We do have a high level of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Here in Ireland, about 40% of adults have experienced sexual violence at least once in their lifetime. 76%, three-quarters of rape defendants were drinking at the time of the alleged offence. There is an observable increase in domestic abuse incidents around big sporting occasions that has been driven directly and entirely by people who are under the influence of alcohol. When late night trading hours were restricted, there was a 2-hour reduction, this was in New South Wales, that there was also a 29% reduction in reports of domestic violence. We have a powerful strategy known as zero tolerance, which is I think a good strategy, except in one particular way. It literally does not mention alcohol at all. We would also say that in any legislation around alcohol licensing, that it should have a primary purpose of reducing violence, and in particular domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. There's definitely a case to be made to ban alcohol sports sponsorship, given that close connection between alcohol and big sporting events. Hello, I'm Sheila Gilheeney. I'm really pleased to be joining you today with Alcohol Review. I'm going to be talking a bit about the work of Alcohol Action Ireland as it relates to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Now, this is a topic, I think it can be a difficult one for many of us to deal with, but I just wanted to go through some of the work that AAI has been doing over the past year. And we have published a series of 3 connected reports. One, which is a major one, draws together the data on alcohol, domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, looking at the data both here in Ireland and further afield. A second report looks at the seasonality of alcohol consumption and its associated harms, because we know that at different times of the year, coming up to bank holidays, for example, Christmas, Easter, there are often increases in alcohol consumption. And we wanted to take a look at that in relation to violence that we would see both in the home and on the street. And then the third of those reports looks at that violence as it relates to alcohol and big sporting occasions. And I think that's very relevant for us as we're coming into the World Cup season at the moment. So I suppose the first thing that I would say, and what has really jumped out from all of the research work that we have, is that we do have a high level of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. Here in Ireland, about 40% of adults have experienced sexual violence at least once in their lifetime, and that would come from a 2022 survey. We know that about 20%, 1 in 5 of young women and 1 in 11 of young men have experienced intimate partner abuse, and that would be research that's coming from Women's Aid. And we also know that this level of violence has been rising. There has been a 10% year-on-year increase in the rise of domestic violence reports to the Gardaí, the Irish police, since 2021. And we also know that notifications notifications from the Gardaí to TUSLA, which would be the social services here in Ireland, that there are considerable numbers of reports being made, over 32,000 in 2024. So where does alcohol intersect with all of that? We certainly know that those domestic violence calls, there's a lot of them, about 1,200 every week, but there is a spike in those calls when you come up to public holidays, and that goes up to about 1,600. We also know from research being done through the Rape and Justice in Ireland report, is that 76%, 3/4 of rape defendants were drinking at the time of the alleged offence. And we know from some research here in Ireland that alcohol can be a factor in up to 70% of domestic violence incidents. That's a report from 2010. And I will say there are variations in that figure, but they are a considerable number at any given time. And what we also know is that when it comes to large sporting events, and this is mainly research from the UK, that there is an observable increase in domestic abuse incidents around big sporting occasions that has been driven directly entirely by people who are under the influence of alcohol. Some of this work, I will just say that it reflects an awful lot of what we have seen from our own work with people who have grown up with alcohol harm in the home. With Alcohol Action Ireland, we have a very specific initiative which we call Silent Voices, which looks at the experiences both of children and of the adult children who have that. And one particular element that we do is we collect stories from adults who kind of recollect their experiences, and those voices to me are really very, very strong. Just looking here at one particular contribution, with the contributor saying, overwhelmed with fear, particularly at bank holiday weekends, and noting the violence that would erupt alongside that. We also know, and again we've reported this in research, that there is a link between alcohol availability and domestic violence. We certainly know that when you have a higher density of alcohol outlets, that you have greater incidence of violence, assault, and of domestic violence in particular. And here in Ireland, 3/4 of the population live within 300 metres of a licensed premises. We knew, looking at other evidence and international evidence, say from Australia, again showing a high level of alcohol involvement in intimate partner and family violence. But there was one particular thing that really jumped out at me when we were looking at the evidence from Australia, is that when late night trading hours were restricted, and there was a 2-hour reduction, this was in New South Wales, that there was also a 29% reduction in reports of domestic violence. And I think that is just so striking that, because sometimes we don't get the opportunity to have the evidence put forward as plainly as that, but it really showed that connection between late night alcohol trading and domestic violence. And I really have to commend actually colleagues in Australia here who have worked so hard in this area. We were delighted that back in 2024, in September of that year, that there was a review of all alcohol legislation being carried out with a view towards trying to reduce violence, family violence. So that review began it was announced in September 2024, and it is going through all of the states in Australia, and we certainly will be looking out with interest to see what the results of that would turn out to be. Here in Ireland, I will say there has been, a considerable amount of work being done in relation to domestic violence. We have a powerful strategy known as Zero Tolerance, which is I think a good strategy, except in one particular way. It literally does not mention alcohol at all. There is zero mention of alcohol, and I can understand in some ways. Sometimes people don't want alcohol to be seen as somehow an excuse for violence. And I want to be very clear that we do not see it as an excuse, neither do we see it as being a primary cause. But what we know and what the research would point to is that it is an accelerator of violence. It is likely to make a bad situation worse. And I suppose it's with that in mind that we would be keen to see that in any future legislation or in any future strategy, that we would recognise that risk factor that actually falls from alcohol. We are concerned that here in Ireland we have a sale of alcohol bill which has been proposed, and one of the things that is concerning about it is that it's proposing a general extension of licensing hours and a facilitation indeed of late night opening till 2:30 a.m. and for nightclubs to be open to 6 a.m, as well as introducing a new type of license called a cultural amenity license. So essentially what we're saying is that licensed outlets could be open for longer and that there would be more of them. And the net result of that, we would say, is there will be more alcohol sold. And with more alcohol being sold, it is likely and consumed, it is more likely that you will see harms from that alcohol consumption. So what are our recommendations? We would say that first and foremost, we would like to see an overall reduction in alcohol consumption. And in Ireland, if we were drinking within the current lower risk drinking guidelines, we would be drinking about a third less what we're currently doing. So we think that that's an important recommendation to have. We would also say that in any legislation around alcohol licensing, that it should have a primary purpose of reducing violence, and in particular domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. We think that there's definitely a case to be made to ban alcohol sports sponsorship, given that close connection between alcohol and big sporting events. We also feel that there's a need for systematic collation of data in relation to alcohol and violence. So often the information that we have comes from one-off surveys, and I think there's a real need to look at this in depth, to log every incident, see is alcohol involved, and that way if you make a change in legislation or you bring about some other different type of policy, you're able to see the impact of that policy. And I think that was why it was so interesting to be able to look at the Australian data and the research that was able to be done as a result, from that. We would certainly say there's obviously a need to increase funding for all services in relation to domestic violence, but we would also say there's a need to be linking in the agencies that work across this, so that would be the alcohol services, domestic violence agencies and their services, but very especially child services as well. And in that context, I think there's a need to create a framework to address the links between alcohol and violence. And most of all, I think we would be saying that in any such policy that has been put in place, we should be prioritising the protection of children. One of the things that really jumped out at us in some of the research is that children who are exposed to violence in the home at an early age, for girls, sadly, they're more likely to become a victim of domestic violence at a later date as an adult. And very sadly, that young boys as well who are exposed to such violence, they themselves are more likely to become a perpetrator of violence. We have pointed to the need for the introduction of a particular programme. It's called Operation Encompass, and that's an early intervention system. And the basic idea is that if the police attend the family home, that by the following morning, when the child goes into school, that the school have been informed that there was a domestic violence incident at the house. So the child is met with a bit of support, and a bit of immediate support, in fact, and understanding of the situations they're in. We're actually very pleased to note that a pilot programme has just been announced last week to begin the introduction of that programme. Most of all, we would be saying that there's a real need to end the silence on alcohol, domestic, sexual and gender-based violence. And I'll just leave, with a quote that we had from one of the researchers that we were looking at, that really points out that ignoring the presence of alcohol, it won't eliminate it in its role in intimate violence, and nor will it prevent it being used as an excuse for violence. But what we would, and we can clearly see, is the more we know about how alcohol affects violence, the better we will be able to develop the effective strategies that are needed in this area. So I just want to thank you for your attention. You can see more about us on our website, Alcohol Ireland, and about our campaigns around this very distinct area of alcohol harm and many others. Thank you.